14 German fighters were closing in rapidly, a wounded bomber formation trailing smoke and leaking fuel, and a single pilot who broke every regulation in the book as he told his men to hang on. He was about to attempt something no pilot over Europe had ever dared. His crew thought he had lost his mind. 5 minutes later, they were still breathing, and the Luftwaffe had a brand new terror to add to its reports. The winter of 1943 seeped into the skin of every aircrew flying from England. Frost clung to the cockpit glass. Warm breath filled oxygen masks with clouds. Far below, the patchwork of British fields vanished under December mist, and high above, the condensation trails of thousands of bombers carved pale scars across the darkened sky. This was the peak of the joint bombing assault. The 8th Air Force was fully committed to daylight precision strikes, an approach born from American optimism and faith in the Norden bombsight, a device that, in training, could supposedly hit a barrel from 20,000 feet. On paper, fleets of B-17 flying fortresses would surge across Nazi-occupied Europe, smash German industry, then fly home shielded by their own layered firepower. In reality, it was a bloodbath. German interceptors ripped into the bomber columns with ruthless efficiency. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s climbed into position, turned directly toward the oncoming bombers, and dove forward at combined speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. The head-on charge became the hallmark of the Luftwaffe's daylight fighter wings. It was savage, effective, and mentally shattering. The American bombers lacked adequate forward-facing guns. Their nose turrets mounted 2.50 caliber machine guns, but the gunners had only a brief moment to spot, aim, and fire before the enemy shot past or tore straight through their formation. Most B-17 bombers were destroyed without ever managing to land a significant shot on the enemy fighters attacking them. The crews understood this reality, the gunners knew it, the pilots knew it, and the Germans knew it as well. By December, some missions suffered casualty rates of more than 20%. Entire groups vanished over the Ruhr Valley or above the rail yards near Schweinfurt. Airmen completed their tours in a state of grim endurance, marking off missions like days in confinement, fully aware that the chances of making it home were slim. Into this brutal world arrived thousands of young Americans who had no experience with combat. Farm kids from Iowa, mechanics from Detroit, students who had left college, and factory laborers, all of them volunteers or draftees sent into a war that required them to climb into metal aircraft and fly straight into lethal skies. They were taught how to stay in tight formations, how to manage oxygen at high altitudes, and how to fire their guns through gloves stiff with ice. But nothing prepared them for the terror of a head-on enemy pass. There was no handbook that could tell them how to endure that moment. Survival depended on fate and chance. The 8th Air Force experimented with different tactics, closer formations, layered altitude structures, and fighter escorts whenever the fighters had the range. But in late 1943, the P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings could barely reach the edge of Germany before needing to return to base. That left the bombers isolated deep over the German homeland, where the Luftwaffe waited. The noise of these missions was overwhelming and almost surreal, the steady thunder of Wright Cyclone engines running at cruise power, the grinding rotation of gun turrets turning on their bearings, the burst of radio calls as pilots identified incoming threats. Then came the shriek of enemy fighters diving in and the harsh, rapid burst of 20mm cannon shells ripping through the bomber's aluminum frame. The wet, sickening impact of bullets striking human bodies, and at times the dreadful quiet that followed when an engine died or a wing collapsed, sending a bomber drifting helplessly toward the ground. Into this harsh and unforgiving arena flew First Lieutenant James Howard on his 23rd combat mission. If this history interests you, make sure to tap like and subscribe. James Howard did not present the image of someone who would transform fighter strategy. He was reserved, controlled, and thoughtful, more of a strategist than a speaker. Born in Canton, China, in 1913 to missionary parents, he spent his early years surrounded by diverse languages, varied cultures, and a constant sense of unpredictability. His father operated a medical mission, while his mother worked as a teacher. Howard grew up watching people confront challenges with limited tools and without any guarantee of outside help. He eventually returned to America to attend college, enrolling at Pomona and studying pre-medicine. But his fascination with flying was stronger than his interest in human biology. In 1937, he left his studies and entered the Navy as an aviation cadet. He was eliminated from the program, not because he lacked talent, but due to a small medical issue that prevented him from flying. For many, that would have been the end of the journey. But not for Howard. He traveled back to China and joined the American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers, in 1941, just months before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Under the leadership of Claire Chennault, he piloted Curtiss P-40 Warhawks against Japanese fighters and bombers across Burma and southern China. The AVG operated with fewer aircraft, less firepower, and in total isolation. They had no replacement parts, no additional troops, and absolutely no room for mistakes. Survival depended on creativity, boldness, and the ability to anticipate the enemy's moves before they happened. Howard excelled. He mastered how to use everything the P-40 did well: its fast dive, its tough frame, its capacity to take heavy damage and still remain airborne. He learned how to lure enemy pilots into vulnerable situations, how to hide himself using clouds and sunlight, and how to avoid fighting on equal terms at all costs. Over 6 months, he earned credit for 6 confirmed aerial victories and became one of the Flying Tiger's most dependable aviators. When the group disbanded in the middle of 1942, Howard went back to the United States and entered the Army Air Forces. He assumed he would be deployed to the Pacific, yet instead he was placed under the 8th Air Force and sent to England as a fighter pilot with the 354th Fighter Squadron, a unit inside the newly created 355th Fighter Group. They flew the P-51 Mustang, a streamlined, long-distance fighter that would eventually become the most iconic escort aircraft of the entire war. But in late 1943, the Mustang force was still limited in number. The bombing campaign was hitting its highest intensity, and casualties continued to rise. Howard was older than nearly every other pilot. At 30 years old, he was considered a seasoned veteran among squadrons filled with men barely in their early 20s. He didn't drink to excess or look for reckless excitement. He read after-action reports. He sought information. He analyzed patterns: how the enemy organized, how formations behaved, where weaknesses opened. His fellow pilots admired him, even if they didn't always comprehend him. He was skilled, steady, and strangely fearless, not in a showy or reckless way, but in a manner that looked like deliberate, careful judgment. He flew as if he were working through a complex problem, one variable at a time. On January 11, 1944, Howard received orders to escort a formation of bombers heading toward German industrial targets near Ostersleben, deep in the center of Germany. It was a mission at the very edge of their operational reach. The fighters had barely enough fuel to rendezvous with the bombers, remain alongside them for a few precious minutes, and then race back across the channel before their tanks went empty. Howard launched into the freezing morning air, formed up with his unit, and climbed toward the main bomber column. He had no way of knowing that within the hour he would find himself isolated over Germany, faced with a decision no training manual had ever outlined. The operation began to unravel 20 minutes from the target. Thick clouds built over the North Sea, visibility collapsed, and radio discipline eroded as flight struggled to keep visual contact. The bomber formation stretched thin, lost its tight structure, and became exposed. Then the first wave of German fighters materialized. They appeared in groups of 4 to 6, rising out of the murk, angling themselves into position ahead of the bombers. The Luftwaffe had turned interception into a deadly, orchestrated assault. Their fighters climbed above and in front of the formation, flipped upside down, and plunged straight through the bombers head-on. At those speeds, the gunners had only a fraction of a moment to fire. The focused barrage, cannon and machine gun rounds converging on one bomber often tore an aircraft apart in seconds. The P-51s moved to intercept. Dogfights ignited across the sky, pilots abandoning their positions to chase threats or protect bombers under attack. Within moments, the clean, orderly structure of the escort disintegrated into scattered, unpredictable combat. Howard's unit was dragged into a running fight with a swarm of Focke-Wulf 190s. He fired, twisted through the air, and tried to keep himself between the German fighters and the vulnerable bombers, but the numbers, angles, and distances were all working against him. There were far too many German fighters and nowhere near enough escorts to counter them. Fuel had already become a serious issue. Every moment spent maneuvering drained precious gallons they couldn't afford to lose. Then Howard lifted his eyes and spotted them, a cluster of B-17s, maybe 30 in all, drifting away from the main bomber stream and sliding westward. They were isolated, no friendly fighters anywhere near them, and circling upward beneath them were at least a dozen German aircraft preparing to strike. Howard glanced at his fuel gauges. He double-checked his heading. He attempted to contact his flight over the radio, but only static answered. He swept the sky, searching desperately for another Mustang. There was nothing. The bombers had only minutes, possibly less, before the first wave of attackers tore into them. If Howard broke away now, he might still have enough fuel to make it back across the channel. But if he chose to engage, he would be taking on more than 10 enemy fighters completely alone. Even if he survived the first clash, the Luftwaffe would quickly realize he was the only defender and overwhelm him with sheer numbers. There was no official procedure for this. No textbook scenario. The choice came down to a harsh, unforgiving equation: leave them to their fate, or fight alone. Howard slammed the throttle forward and plunged straight toward the bomber formation. The German fighters hadn't begun their attack run yet. They were still climbing, coordinating, maneuvering into position. Howard understood immediately that he held one precious advantage: surprise. None of them expected a single Mustang to challenge an entire formation of German fighters. He closed the gap rapidly, the B-17s growing larger through the canopy as he streaked toward them. He could make out the ball turrets swiveling, the waist gunners following the movement below, and the entire bomber group tightening up instinctively as danger rose beneath them. Then the lead group of German fighters broke formation and dove. Howard snapped his aircraft into a hard roll, pulled ahead of their line, and opened fire. His tracer round stitched across the sky and sliced into the wing of a Messerschmitt. The damaged fighter veered away trailing smoke, and the rest of the enemy pilots scattered. A wave of confusion rippled through the German ranks. A single escort should not have posed a major threat, but Howard was not flying like a typical escort pilot. He flew like someone with nothing left to fear and a flawless grasp of angles and timing. The Luftwaffe regrouped quickly. They struck again and again, head-on charges, attacks from the sides, and steep diving runs from above. Howard countered each assault with bursts of gunfire and sharp, precise maneuvers. He refused to get pulled into dogfights. He refused to chase anyone. Instead, he stayed glued to the bomber group, making himself the obstacle every German pilot had to overcome before they could get anywhere near their targets. And then he did something no one would have predicted: he flew directly into the heart of the bomber formation. At the time, fighter tactics were strict. Escort fighters stayed outside the bomber group, guarding the edges, watching the high approaches, and intercepting enemy aircraft before they got close. Flying inside the formation was considered reckless, overly defensive, and completely ineffective. No pilot was supposed to enter that tight, dangerous space. The risk of collision or friendly fire was simply too great. The bombers were flying so closely that their wingtips were nearly touching, leaving almost no margin for error. The swirling turbulence from their propellers and the disturbed air streaming off their wings formed invisible barriers that could throw a smaller aircraft off balance. Any fighter caught in that chaotic airflow risked losing control, smashing into a bomber, or getting mistakenly shot down by its own side. The bomber gunners had been trained to fire at anything fast and moving within their sights. Whether it was friendly or enemy aircraft, if it approached too quickly, they pulled the trigger. But Howard understood something the manual writers never considered. The German tactic depended on executing a clean, uninterrupted head-on approach. Their fighters needed a straight path, high speed, and nothing blocking their line of fire. If a defending fighter planted itself directly in front of the bomber formation, right between the Germans and the planes they were targeting, the attackers were left with only two options: break off the run or gamble on a deadly collision with an armed opponent closing in at a combined speed of more than 600 miles per hour. Howard eased his Mustang into the forward section of the bomber group. He reduced his throttle until he matched their slower pace. He positioned himself just ahead of the lead B-17, low and centered, his silhouette framed plainly against the open sky. The bomber crews spotted him immediately. They had no idea what he intended. Some assumed he had become disoriented. Others worried he had taken damage and was attempting to stay near the formation for help. A couple of gunners instinctively tracked him with their weapons, hands hovering near their triggers as they tried to decide whether he was friend or foe. Then the Germans made their next move. Two Messerschmitts dropped out of the sun at the 11 o'clock position, diving straight toward the formation with their noses pointed down and their cannons ready to fire. The German pilots had a flawless approach. The bombers were rigid in formation, unable to break away or dodge. Their closing speed was textbook, precise, predictable, but Howard was already in position. He held steady, waited until the absolute last moment, and then fired a quick burst before banking sharply to the left. The lead German pilot hesitated, rolled his aircraft, and pulled out of the dive. The second fighter mirrored him. Neither committed to pressing the attack. The danger was simply too great. Howard's Mustang blocked their path, and it was firing. He climbed sharply, rolled, and then returned to the bomber formation. Slipping back into the lead element, just ahead and slightly below the foremost B-17, he became their shield. The bombers adjusted instinctively, the crews realizing that he was no lost pilot. They now understood he was protecting them. The Germans regrouped and tried to press attacks from different angles. Beam runs came first, and Howard met each one head-on from the side. Vertical dives followed. He climbed sharply, forcing them to overshoot. Coordinated multi-angle attacks came next, and with careful pivots and precise fire, he disrupted every attempt. The Luftwaffe showed no sign of giving up. They were determined, experienced, and aggressive, yet physics and risk constraints held them back. Every attack pass Howard challenged ended in failure, consuming fuel, morale, and precious minutes. Slowly, the bomber crews began to synchronize with him. They held their fire when he maneuvered through their fields of fire, giving him space. They called out enemy positions over the radios, watched his six, and covered blind spots. Out of necessity, an unplanned and silent partnership emerged, 1 fighter and 30 bombers operating as a single unit against a numerically superior enemy. For half an hour, Howard fought entirely alone. He burned through ammunition and fuel, enduring hits from small-caliber rounds that tore through his fuselage, missing critical systems by inches. His engine ran dangerously hot, and his hands ached from the strain of constant control inputs. Adrenaline and oxygen debt narrowed Howard's vision to a tunnel. Yet the bombers maintained their formation, and slowly, the Germans began to peel away. The instant Howard's fuel gauge dropped below the reserve mark, the Luftwaffe disengaged. It wasn't a retreat, they had calculated the risk. The bombers were approaching the outer edge of the target zone, and Allied fighters would soon return. The balance of risk versus reward had shifted. One by one, the German fighters pulled away in pairs, diving toward lower altitudes and vanishing into the cloud layer. Howard watched them disappear. He did not pursue. He lacked fuel, had almost no ammunition, and barely had enough speed to stay airborne. Carefully, he eased his Mustang out of the formation. The Lee B-17 waggled its wings, a silent sign of gratitude. Howard returned the gesture, rolled level, and began the long, cautious glide back toward England. His engine coughed twice, fuel starvation. He leaned the mixture carefully, coaxing every last drop of power from a nearly empty tank, gaining another 10 minutes of precious thrust. Through the haze, the English coastline emerged. He crossed it 2,000 feet, too low to be safe, too high to bail out. He landed at the first usable airfield. The Mustang rolled to a stop and the engine died. Howard sat quietly in the cockpit as the ground crew rushed to him. They inspected bullet holes across the wings, tail, and fuselage. They found an engine running on nothing but fumes and sheer luck. They found a pilot who had ventured deeper into enemy territory, stayed longer under fire, and engaged more enemy aircraft than any documented escort mission. And yet, they found no injury on him. Howard climbed out, filed a concise combat report, and spoke only a few words. Howard recounted the bombers, the German fighters, and the maneuvers he executed. He did not exaggerate. He did not assert certainty. He simply reported the facts as they had occurred. The bomber crews, however, had a different perspective. Upon returning to their bases in England, they debriefed with intelligence officers and recounted the mission. They spoke of the lone Mustang that had remained with them for nearly half an hour, of the pilot who had flown within their formation, absorbed attacks intended for them, and transformed himself into a moving barrier against an entire group of German fighters. The gunners estimated that he had engaged 14 enemy aircraft. Some claimed even more. Yet everyone agreed on one point: without that pilot, they would not have made it home. The story spread quickly. Within days, it reached the 8th Air Force headquarters. Commanders reviewed Howard's report, cross-checked it against the bomber crew testimonies, and evaluated the tactical consequences. What Howard had done had defied protocol. By the book, it was reckless, but it had succeeded. In a war where bomber losses were devastating morale and crippling operational capability, results mattered more than strict adherence to doctrine. In April 1944, James Howard was awarded the Medal of Honor. He became the only fighter pilot in the European theater to receive the nation's highest military decoration. The citation highlighted his bravery, skill, and unwavering commitment to the bomber crews under his protection. But the citation left out what mattered most. Howard had not acted out of blind heroism. He had acted with reason. He had identified a problem, analyzed the variables, and implemented a solution no manual had anticipated. He had turned himself into a weapon not by sheer firepower, but through precise positioning. He understood that his presence, rather than his kills, was the critical factor in disrupting the enemy. In doing so, he exposed a flaw in German tactics that no one had previously exploited. The head-on assault had long been the Luftwaffe's most devastating tactic against American daylight bombers. It depended on speed, shock, and the bombers' lack of forward-firing weapons. Yet it also relied on a psychological principle: escorts remained on the periphery. Fighters protected the bombers from a distance. They did not intervene directly. Howard shattered that assumption. Within weeks of his mission, the 8th Air Force began training escort pilots in close-in defensive maneuvers. The objective was not to imitate Howard's lone action, which was unsustainable and, by design, suicidal, but to integrate aspects of his positioning strategy into formal escort doctrine. Fighters began flying closer to the bombers. They placed themselves along the attack vectors most likely to be exploited by German pilots. They did not wait for threats to emerge, they anticipated them. The mere presence of a fighter in the path of a head-on assault forced the Germans to hesitate, adjust, or abort. Loss rates started to decline. The change was not instantaneous, nor was it the sole factor. The arrival of long-range P-51 escorts, improved formation tactics, and the gradual depletion of experienced Luftwaffe pilots all contributed. Yet the shift in escort positioning, the willingness to approach more closely, accept calculated risk, and disrupt rather than merely intercept, became a permanent and defining feature of American escort operations for the remainder of the war. Bomber crews immediately noticed the difference. They felt more secure, flew with greater confidence, and spoke of Howard's mission as living proof that a single pilot, positioned correctly at the critical moment, could influence the outcome of an entire battle. The Germans noticed it too. Intelligence gathered from captured Luftwaffe pilots described American fighters that refused to abandon the bombers, stayed close even under heavy fire, and made coordinated attacks far more challenging. The tactic did not eliminate German interceptions, but it reduced their effectiveness. And in a war defined by attrition, that advantage was enough. Howard returned to combat. He flew more missions, trained incoming pilots, and continued refining his tactics. He was not one to seek fame or self-promotion. He rarely gave interviews and never pursued recognition. He simply flew, fought, and survived. By the war's end, he was credited with 6 aerial victories in the European theater, in addition to 6 achieved with the Flying Tigers. While his official tally was modest compared to some aces, the numbers alone did not capture his influence. Howard demonstrated that courage without logic was empty, and logic without courage was useless. Only when combined could they alter outcomes. James Howard survived the war. He remained in the Air Force, rose to the rank of Brigadier General, and retired in 1966 after nearly 3 decades of service. He lived quietly in Florida, away from the public eye, and seldom spoke about the mission that earned him the Medal of Honor. When asked in later years, he would simply say that he had done what the situation required. He never labeled it heroism, he called it problem-solving. He witnessed bombers in peril, recognized a gap in their defenses, and stepped into it. He often said that the success of his actions was as much luck as skill. Yet those who flew alongside him saw differently. They observed a man who had trained himself to think clearly under fire, to remain calm when chaos reigned, and to act decisively when others would have hesitated. They recognized someone who understood that victory in war was not achieved by blindly following rules, it came from knowing when to break them. The maneuver Howard executed that day, flying within the bomber formation to disrupt head-on attacks, was never formally codified. It was deemed too dangerous, too reliant on personal judgment, and too easily misapplied. Yet it endured in the oral tradition of fighter tactics. Instructors recounted the story, pilots debated its merits, and in the decades that followed, elements of the concept were incorporated into air combat doctrine worldwide. Howard's legacy was never just a single tactic. It was a mindset, the understanding that success in aerial combat depended not on raw bravery alone, but on geometry, timing, and the courage to occupy the space where the enemy least expected you. In the vast chronicles of World War II aviation, his name appears less frequently than it should. He was not flamboyant. He did not accumulate an extraordinary score. He did not conform to the archetype of a swaggering ace. Yet the bomber crews who survived that January 11, 1944 mission knew the truth. They carried the memory of his actions with them for the rest of their lives. Some named their sons after him. Some wrote letters of thanks decades later. Others simply recounted the story repeatedly to anyone who would listen. In a war that consumed millions, James Howard demonstrated that a single individual, in a single critical moment, could change the outcome not with overwhelming firepower, not with luck, but through the rare combination of clarity, courage, and the refusal to believe that the impossible was truly impossible. He passed away in 1995 at the age of 81. His funeral was attended by veterans, fellow pilots, and men who had flown in bombers over Germany half a century earlier. Their conversations did not dwell on tactics or military doctrine. Instead, they remembered the day a lone Mustang remained in the skies when every rational reason dictated retreat. And they reflected on the enduring lesson he left behind, that the greatest weapon in war is not the machine itself, but the mind that dares to wield it in an extraordinary way.